Will Christians be raptured? Is there a coming 7-year tribulation? These are the questions that Dr. Matthew Halsted, a biblical scholar, answers in his new book, The End of the World as You Know It. I'll warn you though, his answers may shock you. By the end of this video, you'll see the key biblical passages that are used in support of the rapture, and you'll see why it's a mistake to interpret those passages in that way. My goal is to help you understand what the Bible really teaches about the end times, and we're starting right now. Matt, what is the rapture?
The rapture is this idea that sometime in the future, Jesus will return to earth, but it's not a complete return. It's not like he puts his feet on the ground or anything like that. The basic idea goes is that he comes to the clouds or comes on the clouds and he stays up there, but simultaneously he raptures up or brings up the saints who are, Christians, those who are Christians on the earth at that time, brings them up with him into the clouds and immediately takes them back to heaven for some period of time. The popular view is about 7 years, maybe a little bit more than that. And this is imminent. It happens very quickly. It's kind of the twinkling of an eye, with one little blink and it happens. And the important thing to remember about the rapture is that at that point, the end times proper begins, for that view. So as the Christians, all of the Christians across the globe are raptured into heaven, it's at that point, or it could be months or maybe a year later or immediately, the Antichrist shows up and starts this period that's known as the tribulation. But that's a very broad perspective. That's, the perspective of the authors of Left Behind, and many others.
Okay, so in your chapter on the rapture, you discuss 4 passages. The first passage is Revelation 3:10. It says, "Because you have kept my word about patient endurance, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world, to try those who dwell on the earth."
We jump to Revelation here, and I do talk a little bit about this passage in the rapture chapter. But yeah, so it's kind of a complicated thing. For those who believe in this rapture idea, tend to think, not all of them, but tend to think that the 7 churches that John addresses in Revelation represent 7 periods of church history, okay? And so you have Ephesus, and then, you go through those Revelation chapter 2, chapter 3 records these messages to the 7 churches, and they're individualized messages. And a lot of rapture proponents, again, not all of them, but many of them will say each one of those churches represent a certain time period in history. So for example, the first church is going to represent the apostolic church, okay? And then after that, you're going to have the next period of time, a few hundred years or whatever, and it just kind of keeps going. And then finally, when you get down to the end, on into Revelation chapter 3, you get, in their view, closer to the end times, right? Because you have this progression of churches. I reject that. Let me just start here with what's wrong with that. As a number of scholars, people like Craig Keener and David De Silva, for example, they've pointed out that view of church history is rather one-dimensional. And it's actually, for starters, it's very Western-centered. Everything under those views seem to revolve around what's happening in Europe or in America or whatever. But that seems counterintuitive. That doesn't seem to be appropriate. The second thing is, can you really whittle church history down to, be that uniform? So, for example, for the church at Laodicea, who is, quote, lukewarm, oftentimes people say we're living in the age of Laodicea because we're so lukewarm. And, I just respond to that and it's like, what part of the church is lukewarm? Maybe the American church, I can see that. But what about the South Asian church, who they're on fire for Jesus? They're surviving under persecution and they're actually thriving despite the persecution. They don't seem lukewarm to me. And the only way we could get to this idea that the whole church is lukewarm would be to say that the whole church looks like us. And that seems rather me-centered. That seems rather inappropriate in a number of ways too. And it's sad because often in these speculations, I say we Americans especially, we tend to forget and ignore and altogether neglect the global church. And I think that's unfortunate, and that leads to bad interpretation. So I reject the view that the 7 churches represent 7 periods of church history. I think it's flawed. I don't think it works. Okay, and so when you get to that passage in Revelation 3:10, it says, "I'll keep you from the hour of trial." Some proponents of rapture theology will say that's likely an indication that that church represents the church of the rapture, age. And if you live in that time, you'll be kept from the hour of tribulation by how? By being raptured, right? And I find that altogether unsatisfying, mainly because of the way I read Revelation. I mean, Revelation was written to the first century church. John expects the readers in the first century church to not only understand what he's saying, but also to apply and to obey what he's saying. And it seems to me if that meant, to refer to the future church, then it has no bearing upon the church that it was actually written to. So that doesn't work for me. And I think that these need to be interpreted to be timeless truths such that it can apply to both us and to the first century church. But under that idea, it just wouldn't apply to the first century church because they don't live during the time of the rapture, right? And so I happen to think that the better understanding there of that passage is that, and I forget how I worded it in the book, but it's essentially to say that's just a specific word for them that, God's going to keep them from that hour. But the interesting thing here is that I'm not convinced that it means that he's going to keep them from tribulation as much as it is, maybe he's going to help them through it. And so, I think I go into a little bit of that in the book as well. And so, yeah, I think, does that answer your question with respect to 3:10?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep. Okay,
Cool.
so the next passage is 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 18. And to me, this is the big one. I feel like the others kind of reinforce maybe what this one's doing. So, yeah, we can spend more time on this if you want. Totally up to you. Okay, here's what it says. But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. For this we declare to you by a word from the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, and with the sound of the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will always be with the Lord. Therefore, encourage one another with these words.
Those who believe in rapture are going to say that this is definitely the token text that says, we're going to be caught up in the clouds. I mean, you can't get more clear than that. You're going to be caught up in the clouds and then taken away for however long. Now, people who believe in the rapture won't go so far as to say that this text tells us how long we'll be away. They won't say that. They get that from other texts and views that they have about the tribulation. A little bit from Daniel, a little bit from Revelation, elsewhere and stuff. But for me, I reject that view. There's a couple of reasons, actually. It's not just because I don't like it. I mean, to be honest with you, I would love to be rescued out of and from tribulation. That sounds terrific to me. But at the end of the day, I'm not allowed to, center my interpretation around comfort, but just around truth. And, let's just be honest interpreters and then whatever happens, right? From the best of my understanding, we need to approach this text as, first century Christians living right among the Thessalonian church, okay? And how would they have interpreted this? As it turns out, we can find some clues to that, because in that same passage that you just read, there are two concepts that are spoken about there. This idea of the coming of the Lord, parousia, okay, that's the Greek word, parousia, and then this other concept of meeting the Lord, going out to meet, apantesis. That's another idea of meeting. It turns out that those two concepts were, relatively well known in the ancient world. Parousia, this idea of the coming of the Lord, actually could be translated the presencing of the Lord. Parousia, presencing. And so what does that mean? And I think in Matthew chapter 24 and other places, this definitely has this idea of the showing up, like of Jesus. He's going to make himself known. Like the disciples are always like, hey, are you going to make yourself known? Let's make you king. And this is the idea of parousia, of showing up, really presencing yourself, right? And the idea of coming as a translation works so long as we understand that, this means more of this idea of the type of person showing up sometimes and the motive in showing up. That's the idea of presencing. So in the ancient world, if we look outside the Bible, for example, in the ancient world, this was a common practice of a royal dignitary showing up or presencing his, or in some cases herself, whoever the dignitary was, whether it was an emperor, a vassal king, an envoy or whatever. The practice was that as the dignitary was coming into town, the local citizens would go out of the town proper and off into sort of the countryside to meet the dignitary out there who was presencing his or herself in order to bring them back to the city. And this was literally kind of a parade. As I recall, this sort of thing happened, in multiple places. I think I'm drawing a blank, but there are a couple of places. I think Josephus even uses one of those words as well. And I was going to say Suetonius, but I think it's Dio-Cassius. But anyway, these are places where there are places in the literature where it shows, these concepts being done. Anyway, the point is, it was just customary, respectful, and honoring of the dignitary for the city to go out and meet them. It's kind of what we do today. Now, in today's time, if the president of the United States was going to come to, your city, more than likely he would fly in on Air Force One, but land at the local Air Force base or something like that. And then they would get the limo and then do this huge entourage through the town. They'd block off streets and stuff. It's not really how it worked back then. I mean, they didn't have airplanes to go straight into the middle of the town. They had to, on horse and buggy, that's more American, but you know what I mean. They would come in on their horses and many people walking, and they would come in that way. So you knew when they were coming. You knew in days in advance if it was a long trip when they were coming, so you could prepare for this sort of thing. Okay. Whereas now, I mean, the president could land in my home state and I wouldn't know it until the day of because maybe he doesn't, sometimes those things are secret. And so it's a surprise, right? But again, back then there was this expectation of going out and meeting them. And you even still see this with dignitaries today, like the royal family in the UK, for example. Many times they line the streets whenever there's some event. And we do the same for our president and other, dignitaries or whatever. It's just customary to have a greeting like that. And it's always been customary. It's how we've always done things. And it was done that way back then. But the important thing to know here is that when people would go out to meet the dignitary, they didn't go away with him, right? They would actually bring him back in. Like it was the opposite. They would usher him into the town in a parade with excitement and joy. Because that was to show that, hey, we recognize your lordship over our city. This is your city, not ours, and we welcome you to it. And I actually think that's what's happening in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Again, some of these same words are used in that passage, and so I'm having to ask myself, if we want to be decent historians, we need to say, okay, how would they have understood these concepts? Never mind how we think. Put aside our own prejudice for a moment. How would they naturally have taken those words and those concepts? And I think we know how they would take it. And then you combine this with Revelation's idea that heaven's going to come to earth, and then the two will become one. This is definitely that compatible with that. Now, what a person could say in response to me is say, we're meeting him in the clouds, right? And so what's the point of that? And I would say, because he's not coming into a city, he's coming to the earth. The middle place has to be up there, right? I mean, you're not going out into an alley or it's not like, hey, Jesus saying, hey, everybody want to meet you off of Broadway in Manhattan. No, it's going to be up in the air. And there's really good reason to think that this is just metaphorical language anyway, just ways of depicting a reality. I'm not suggesting that Jesus' return is metaphorical. I think he will return in bodily form, but some of the language and how we describe that might be metaphorical. It might not be. I just take the position. I just take it as it is. I'm assuming that we'll just meet him up literally in the air and then we'll bring him back in. I don't know how this works, but that's the language that we use. And it's definitely, it does say that we'll forever be with the Lord in that passage, or I forgot how the New Revised Standard Version rendered that. But it's the idea that, and so we will always be with the Lord, I think is the language. It doesn't say where, you could, okay, if you say, will always be in the Lord in the air, I mean, that doesn't make sense for any view. The rapture people couldn't have that view anyway. If you took it literally, and it just doesn't say that you'll be taken away to heaven. Now one could say, but it also doesn't say we'll be bringing him back to the earth. And I'll admit that, like, doesn't say that, but that's not my argument. My argument is that's how they would have conceived of that, given the language, the concepts, and the regular usage of those ideas in first century. I think it's got the better bang for the buck. I think it has more explanatory power. So that's my view.
Okay, let me go to the third passage. This is John 14, verses 1-3. And if I recall in the chapter, you interact with John MacArthur's interpretation of this particular passage. So John 14, 1-3 says, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also."
Yeah, this is a classic view, and I go into some more detailed arguments there. Let me back up just a bit. I wanted to look at, I couldn't write everything on this topic. It needed to be within one chapter, So I had to choose what verses I use, right? And so what I did was I let the other side pick the verses that we used. And so, for example, Tim LaHaye, he is, I forgot how many passages he thinks actually teaches the rapture. But he gives, I think, the top 3 in one of his books. And the top 3 are 1 Thessalonians 4. The second one is John 14, the one that we're looking at now. And the third one is 1 Corinthians 15. And so I just focused mainly on those. I dabble a little bit here and there on the other ones. But so anyway, these are the top passages. And of course, John 14 is one of the most important ones. And so the view goes that, Jesus has left. He's leaving his disciples to go away somewhere to prepare a place for them. And then the assumption is when he comes back, he'll take us back to that place that he built, right? A ways away. Okay, now where do you think that would be? It's got to be in heaven under this view, right? Okay, but that creates some difficulties, right? Because are the people who believe in the rapture and they believe that text is about a rapture, are they saying that we're going away to... let me back up. This sounds definitely an eschatological passage, like he's making a final eternal home for us. If that's the case, then it can't be in heaven where we go, because heaven's not the final place where we go. We have resurrection and the creation of new earth. So that's something to consider. The other thing to think about is when you take seriously Revelation's idea of the marriage between heaven and earth, that even if Jesus is going away to prepare a place for you, when he comes back, it doesn't necessarily follow that he'll take you back to that place. What if that place is coming here, right? And I think this squares the best with the final vision of the eschaton in Revelation, that heaven and earth come together and marry. So, in a holy matrimony kind of service, right? The two shall become one. And I think that's what Jesus is talking about here. There's just no indication to me that he's saying anything other than speaking about his second coming, which will end all things, right? I don't know. Does that help explain it?
Yeah, let me make sure I track with that, because that's what I was thinking as well. If heaven comes to earth and you form this union, then it makes sense that this passage is eschatological, like a final sort of end. It's not just like, oh, it's near the end, but it's not the end. It seems like, yeah, he can go prepare a place for you in heaven. That's fine. But now heaven's going to come to earth, and there's going to be this union. And so now here's this place. You're with Jesus. You're in this place that he made for you, but it's here. He brought it to you. That's what you're saying?
It is. And that view makes sense of that passage, right? It fits quite well if you take that view. And I think that's the emphasis. There's just no need. It seems pointless to have a rapture happen when you could just have the second coming right there, right? It just doesn't strike me as being taken away, because Jesus seems to be talking about the final eschaton. He's preparing a place, a dwelling place. Like, this is the idea of eternal dwelling place, right? And this is about rapture. I mean, what's the conclusion? That you're going to go be in heaven forever in your eternal place? Now, they might say, no, but our eternal place is in heaven. He's going to take us there for 7 years, and then we all come back with that place. They could say that, I think so. They could say that. But at the end of the day, I don't feel like that interpretation should be favored over the one that I've just given. Basically, because it's certainly, let me just say this, that view is not a slam dunk, because it doesn't negate those other views. Now, I think if there's if there's a debate about this and we just can't agree, John 14, it could go either way. Fine, let's go back to 1 Thessalonians 4:13. And I think if that's going to be where the battle is fought, it's definitely, given the cultural context, the words that are used there, and the political connotations of those words, it's definitely not a rapture idea there. And so, since we know that, I think that's where the debate probably will be settled. Probably not on John 14. I can't remember how I get into, I mean, I remember what I say in that chapter, but as I was interacting with a few people, I've actually found some inconsistency in I think it was in John MacArthur's idea that he was, but I forget. I hate to say it here because I don't want to misrepresent his view.
Yeah,
but he was slightly inconsistent with how he applied his criterion for evaluating whether something was a rapture text as opposed to a second coming text. And I show that in the book where he's slightly inconsistent. And so, anyway, long story short, part of crafting one's view is to look at the other views and see if they have explanatory power, but when those start breaking down, it leaves you more interested in looking at other explanations.
Okay, the fourth text that we're going to look at is 1 Corinthians 15, 50 to 58. So it says this, I tell you this, brothers, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Behold, I tell you a mystery, we shall not all sleep, we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. For this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on immortality. When the perishable puts on the imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that it is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, who gives the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. What do you think about that one?
Yeah, it definitely cannot be a rapture text. A couple reasons. First, let me just hit on the specific passage that you just read. This is clearly an eschatological, final events, all things being made new text. We have a clear reference to the resurrection, which is something that definitely happens at the end, as part of the final event. And, you have finally the final defeat of death. Oh, death, where is your sting? I mean, this is clearly the language of finality, which means it cannot be the language of rapture, because on the rapture view, that's not the final event. That by no means, that's not the final event under their view. So that's one problem with the rapture view there. The second problem is perhaps even more difficult to overcome for the rapture view. And it's this. If you read 1 Corinthians 15, this is clearly about the resurrection of the change. The context here is definitely about a physical bodily resurrection. And the change that passage you read mentions is this, the twinkling of the eye, the immediate change. This is what and how it happens at the resurrection, that we are given new bodies. And there it's talking about a physical body. There's some interesting language there about it's a physical body, but it's spiritually constituted in some way. And there's debates about all these sorts of things, but it's clearly resurrection language. This does not strike me, and if you read the whole chapter especially, it doesn't strike one as being anything other than the final event. And I actually happen to think that given what we know about 1 Thessalonians 4 already, like we've said, when the king comes and we welcome him back into his kingdom, things change, things are transformed, and it's going to be immediate. And wherever the king dwells, that's where his enemy will not. And I think that this passage is just another way of saying what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4. It's another way of saying, because in that same passage Paul says, always abound in the work of the Lord. Like, in the meantime, get to work, And I think that's a John 14 idea too, is, I'm preparing a place for you. I'm going to go do this. But the assumption is you need to be faithful and get to work and be of good cheer. I'm going to be with you even during that interim time. And so I think there's a way to see all of these passages come together and not speak about rapture, but actually speak about the coming king who, when he comes, we are made new. Indeed, all things are made new.
The tribulation plays an important role in rapture theology. How does the New Testament speak of that word tribulation?
And that's a really important question and topic. I spent at least a couple chapters on that question. One thing I ask the reader to do is, it's something that can be kind of scary. And I recognize that is, to to ask the reader, take your glasses off, your interpretive lens. And by that, I don't mean your interpretive lens, but I mean your assumptions that you're bringing to the text, and just set them aside for a moment. And you can pick them up later, but in the meantime, just set them aside and just let the text speak to you. And when it comes to this, I just take the reader through the text and say, basically, let these texts just wash over you. Like, just let them be. And one thing that I show in the book is that tribulation language is used in a multitude of different ways. I can think of at least 3 ways. So, for example, there are times when the word tribulation, and the word is thlipsis, kind of a funny way to say it, thlipsis, and it's translated in various different ways. Like, if you use the English Standard Version, for example, sometimes the word is translated as tribulation. Sometimes it's translated as affliction, time of affliction. That makes things really interesting because, as English readers, if we see the word affliction, we don't think tribulation. I mean, affliction's bad, but it wouldn't have the same effect if it said tribulation, because then our ears perk up because we've been trained to think of tribulation as an end time event, right? But let's suppose that we were to translate everything as like some sort of, just use the word tribulation. Oh, no, let's just use the word thlipsis. And I take the reader through the text and I show that it's used in at least 3 different ways. The first way is that it's used to refer to the future. There are times when it's clearly a reference to times of trial in the future. Jesus says, for example, that in the world you will have tribulation. He's saying you will have it, right? And that's John 16:33. And so it's a future idea, arguably a present one too, because in the book of Acts, I can't remember the exact reference, but in the book of Acts, the word, thlipsis is used to refer to a tribulation during that period of time when persecution rose up after the stoning of Stephen. Okay, this is a time of persecution. And I think there's another reference there too. I can't quite remember. But anyway, it's really easy to show that tribulation is definitely a present issue in the New Testament. In fact, here's one for you. In Revelation chapter 1, John says to the 7 churches, he says, I am a partner with you in the tribulation. Like, he's saying that, those exact words. I am a partner with you in the tribulation. So that's interesting. Interestingly enough, the word tribulation, and in fact, great tribulation, is used to refer to the past. So in Acts, when the story of Israel is kind of essentially being retold, it's talking about the story of Joseph and how the famine comes upon Egypt and the area around Egypt. And that time period is called a Great Tribulation. In the ESV, forgive me if I'm wrong here, but I think in the ESV it says a time of great affliction or something like that. It just shows you that the word tribulation can be used to refer to a past event, a long event a time ago. So what I do is I just take that data and say, okay, fine. Since we were willing to take our assumptions aside and set them aside, what do you believe about the tribulation now? This concept of tribulation. You have to say that it's a reality of every era, right? In some sense. Now, one thing I do get into is I do say that there does seem to be something unique about a New Testament tribulation that the Bible talks about. So I follow Craig Keener. Craig has written an excellent commentary on Revelation, and I highly recommend everybody, that should be your next book to go buy. It's super helpful. It's in the NIV application commentary. It's just gold. Anyway, he talks a lot about Revelation chapter 12, and this is that famous passage. It's a nativity scene, essentially. It's the nativity scene I want in my yard every Christmas. But it's the scene where the woman who represents Mary, represents Israel. It's kind of a fluid concept, but it's clearly Mary at this scene. She's giving birth to a baby, and there's a dragon who's standing beside her, waiting to eat the baby as soon as the baby's born. But thankfully, the baby is born and is caught up into heaven. And then following that, there's a war in heaven. And the dragon is kicked out of heaven as a result of this, after this baby, child of the woman, is taken up to heaven. Dragon's kicked out, and then the dragon starts to pursue the woman and the rest of her children. And that's sort of a condensed, compressed version of the life of Jesus. He's born of a woman. He's almost killed. Think of Herod and all of that. And then he is taken up into heaven. Think of the ascension. It sort of gives you a fast forward of the whole redemption story there. takes up to heaven, and then he sets the assumption there, like in Hebrews and in the Psalm 110, talks about the Lord sitting at the right hand of Yahweh and assuming authority, and he's going to sit there and rule over the nations until death is defeated, which is the final enemy. And so the idea is that the baby, the child of the woman, is in heaven and takes the seat, the throne, and then Satan, the accuser, can no longer accuse. He's defeated, tossed to the earth. Okay. And it's at this point in Revelation, in the narrative of Revelation, where Satan makes war against the rest of her offspring. Okay. And which would be Christians. And it says that, those who hold to the testimony of Jesus. And the way he does that is by raising up two different beasts, one from the sea, one from the earth. Okay. And this is clearly, by the way, these two beasts are clearly, some sort of reference to the sea monster of Job. And in Isaiah chapter 27, verse 1, you have this twisting serpent, right? And a dragon, I think is how the Greek Old Testament gives it. It's called a dragon. And same word that's used in Revelation, by the way. And so it's clearly like this Leviathan figure. And then the land monster will be maybe a behemoth. Sort of, there are these mythic concepts of, and by mythic, I'm not saying John is wrong or anything, but these are just ways of writing about reality that's otherwise difficult to discuss. So you need these sorts of language and vocabulary to discuss these things. Anyway, long story short, I do think that tribulation is unique to our time period because, according to Revelation, the war gets started at the ascension of Jesus. That's when Satan is kicked out. That's why he's roaring like a lion. That's why he's seeking to whom he may devour. All these sorts of things. And so he's been defeated, at the cross, at the ascension. You get this really interesting passage in the New Testament where it says, I think 1 Corinthians, had the powers known that they were crucifying the Lord of glory, they basically signed their own death warrant. They wouldn't have done it. And so you get this idea that it's at the cross, at the resurrection, at the ascension where evil is defeated. And so when you get to the ascension, I think that's really where, and this is sort of what I argue in my book, is that's a unique time period for trial and tribulation. Okay. And that's why we can have tribulation experiences now. And I think that will be true all the way until the very end until the return of Jesus, when he shows back up and destroys the dragon, finally destroys the dragon. And so the tribulation, in my view, and other scholars' view, is that it's that long period of time between the first and second coming of Christ. Again, right along with Craig Keener, I believe Craig and Michael Brown say this in their book. They have a little book called Not Afraid of the Antichrist. And I think they're correct because they say, it could get really difficult right before the time of Jesus coming back, And I say that same thing too, is, it could get more difficult the closer we get. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what that means. And I don't think we can really know when I don't know how far you want to get into this, but I don't really think we can know if we're even in the final tribulation. Like, let's suppose that things get really rough for us tomorrow. Okay. How do we know that's the final tribulation? We really don't, because somebody say, well, it's the worst it's ever been. And maybe it is, but that doesn't mean it's the final one, because what if there's another worse one that's coming after that? And so we just don't know. And Craig and Michael Brown, Craig Keener, Michael Brown, they say, and I quote them in my book, they say, Satan doesn't know who the final Antichrist will be or who, when the final events will happen. Because if he did, then he would know when Jesus comes back. But nobody can know that. So the idea is that Satan always has something going at any given point. And, and I think tribulation is very cyclical. I think if Keener talks about this too, is that it's very cyclical. Is that it could get intense now and then it eases up, it gets intense, and it might be easy now for us, hard for Asian Christians, and then it might switch later, get hard for us and easier on them. That's very possible. And so there's a lot we just don't know. What we can know is that we're called to be faithful in every season of life, no matter how difficult or how easy it is. And quite honestly, we think of tribulation as the hard times. I wonder if tribulation and trial isn't the easy times. I mean, it's during the easy times where you're tempted to really forsake the Lord, when things are good, when you got cash in your back pocket. That's when, take the global church in the majority of the world, they're being persecuted like crazy right now in some pockets of the world. But the church is growing, And like Tertullian said, He said, the blood of the saints is the seed of the church. We just keep, that's when you grow. And we actually die whenever things are going easy. So which part is the tribulation? That's a very interesting concept, actually.
Okay, so I know we're running short on time, but as best you can, Jesus speaks of the Great Tribulation, or I should say a Great Tribulation. I don't think he says a Great Tribulation in Matthew 24. How do you understand Matthew chapter 24, and how does it impact this view that you elaborated on about how you think of tribulation?
Yeah. Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse is what it's called. You can also look at the Mark version, Mark 13. So I spent a lot of time in this in the book. And, oh man, how do I explain this? I tell you what, I'll just kind of give a very overview of my take on it. And if you want to push back or, pry or poke some holes in it, we can chase some rabbit trails. When I talk about the tribulation, I really need to address Matthew 24 because the word tribulation is used there. And so I think that's an important passage. So it's important to get the context here, okay? A lot of people take this as an easy to interpret passage that's clearly about the final events, right? That's like the future, okay? When you take some time to really closely read Matthew 24, it doesn't read like that, okay? For a couple of reasons. One reason is Jesus says at one point in the narrative, he says, all these things will take place, in this generation's time, right? And so that should be our first clue that something weird is going on. He actually says, this generation will by no means pass away until all things are fulfilled. That's his exact language. And some rapture proponents say what he's talking about there is the generation of the rapture people, right? That's what that generation will pass. That's a strained reading, and you really kind of have to make some things do some, what they say, exegetical calisthenics. Like they do got to do some funny gymnastics there to make that work, in my opinion. I don't think that's the natural reading. But anyway, leave that aside. There are other things going on. The first important factor is to notice how the conversation gets started. So when you look up into Matthew chapter 24, the disciples are saying to Jesus, hey, look at the temple. Isn't it beautiful? Isn't it magnificent? And by the way, Josephus, in his writings, he talks about the glory of the temple. He said, if you're coming up on it far away, you will see just it glisten in the air almost, and it just looks beautiful. And so everybody was infatuated with the temple. It was a beautiful sight, I imagine. And so the disciples are oohing and awing over it. And then Jesus says, hey, there's coming a day when not one stone of this temple is going to be left upon another. In other words, it's going to come crumbling down. Okay. And then that, you can imagine what's happening here in the disciples' mind. I mean, they've just been gloating over this beautiful temple, and Jesus is saying, yeah, don't do that too much because it's not going to last. And then I'd like to read just this passage because I think it's really important that we get the context word for word here. But it's Matthew 24 verses 3. It says, when right after that event, the thing that Jesus says about the temple being destroyed. Right after that, it says, when he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign of your coming end of the age? Okay, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming in the end of the age? Now we have to really think extremely carefully about this because, when Jesus, how would the disciples have understood all that? How would they have understood the destruction of the temple? It would have clearly have been to them an eschatological event, just a very difficult thing to comprehend. And in their mind, I think that they think all of this is going to happen at once. That that the temple will be destroyed. That's the end of the age. That's when Jesus comes. Okay. And actually that word there for coming again is parousia. Okay. So, and remember the word that Paul used there in 1 Thessalonians 4, the parousia, the coming of the Lord. And that's the exact word that's being used here. Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign of your parousia, your presencing, okay, in the end of the age. Now, in the disciples' mind, that's what they're after. Are they thinking second coming? That assumes that they also knew that he would be going away for a while. And yeah, he did seem to talk about elsewhere about his dying and stuff, but these are knuckleheaded disciples at times. Are they really understanding all this? Arguably, they're not. So what do they mean by the coming of the Lord? I think that their thinking is parousia, this presencing, this showing up when are you going to make yourself public, And clearly it's got to be when the temple's destroyed, and that's going to be the end of the age, when the Messiah shows up, right? So they think all of this is going to happen at one point, one time. Okay, and then Jesus gives them an answer. They said, when will these things be? The destruction of the temple and the sign of the end of the age, and you're showing up. Jesus, I think, is going to answer that question, that single question, as if they were two different questions. And he doesn't really tell the disciples this. It's classic Jesus, right? Where he's going to be pretty vague, and he wants them to search out the answer, I think. I think he proceeds to tell them about the destruction of the temple right after that. Okay, when will these things be? And then right after this, he begins saying, beware of seeing this, being aware of that, and all these things, the signs of the end and the tribulation and things like that. I think there he's talking about the destruction of the temple. And then he does that from basically verse 3 to verse 35. So I encourage all your listeners, get out your Bible and look at verse 3 to 35. And that's all about the destruction of the temple. At verse 36, he picks up once again the question of the end of the age and his parousia, his showing up. He's going to show up, and he knows this off into the future. Okay, the disciples don't realize that yet. He's going to show up finally at that point. Okay, and so that's how I read Matthew 24. Now, there's probably a load of different questions here. We can get into those if you want to. Yeah, so if you want to push back any, because I know people are probably thinking, wait a second, but there are things within that passage that sounds like the end, but Matt's saying it's all about the destruction of the temple that happened in AD 70. And I'm saying, yeah, I think so. But anyway, you can feel free to push back, but that's just a very general picture.
Yeah, I think I may leave something for the viewers to explore more.
And by the way,
I do plan to make a video.
I go into all the arguments in my book. I show you how that works, and I think that's a better view. And people might say, Matt's a preterist, like he puts everything in the first century. That's actually not true, and you just need to read the book, okay? Because there is more going on here than meets the eye, perhaps. But anyway, I'll leave it there, and you just have to read the book.
Okay, so to wrap this up, you have several other chapters. You have a chapter on Are We in the End Times? I'm not going to read them all, but you talk about the mark of the beast and the Antichrist. So really good, excellent stuff. I would encourage people to go get the book. But at the end, you give kind of your conclusions. And you don't have to say all of your conclusions, but maybe if there's one big idea that you want to leave my viewers with, what would that be?
Okay, that's an excellent question. I would say, and this might seem odd for someone who just wrote a book on the end times, I would say just remember that if you're studying eschatology, there's a lot you cannot know. There's just a lot you can't know. And that's very frustrating to people like me who are problem solvers, who like, to be task oriented, and they don't sleep well until the job's done, And so when it comes to studying eschatology, it can be kind of frustrating because you're like, I really want to know more. I want to know more about the Antichrist. Is there going to be an Antichrist? If so, I want to know more about him. I want to know more about the tribulation of the future, so I can, just know. I need to know these things, right? The truth is, and the more I research this, the truth is I just don't think we can know much. I think, and many scholars have said this, and so I'm not saying anything new, but I think the second coming of Christ will be a whole lot like the first coming of Christ, in some respects, I should say. The first coming of Christ was preceded by a bunch of prophecies about the Messiah, right? The Old Testament doesn't use the Messiah in that sense a lot of times, but there are other clues. So Isaiah talks about this suffering servant who will rescue Israel. There's this motif, the seed motif, the seed of the woman. There's the Son of Man in Daniel, right? And you get all these ideas, just hints and clues, and a son's going to be born in Isaiah and that kind of stuff. But it's very cryptic. It's very ambiguous. And you really don't understand those passages until Jesus shows up, does his thing, and then you can put your Jesus lens on and look backwards and read the thing differently in light of the coming of Jesus. I actually think that's probably how it's going to work with the second coming. There's no reason to think otherwise. That we get lots of clues and hints and tidbits here and tidbits there, and we're good to pay attention to each of those things. But I don't think we're going to really know much until he shows back up, sets us down, say at a campfire, and says, okay, let me explain the scriptures to you. This is what Paul meant. this is what Matthew meant. This is what, yada. And then we're going to say, oh, see, I got that a little bit, but now that you're saying that, I get it totally now. I think it'll work a lot like that. And I think it's very purposeful because, one, I don't think God is interested in us being Nostradamuses, right? Where, peering into the future, knowing what, setting our eschatological calendars by the day, date setting, and all this kind of stuff. I think the future is territory that belongs to God alone, and the gift that he's given us is the present. And I think the message we get from the New Testament about anticipating the Lord's return is to take the talents that he's given us, and he's gone away for a while, but he's given us some talents. And we have choices to make with those talents that, will we be a good steward of them and multiply them, be faithful with what he's given us? Or will we be scared and stick them in the ground? Are we going to be like the disciples when John, the disciple John, was rumored to possibly be alive when Jesus returns again and all that kind of stuff? You remember that story? And it created quite the controversy, I suppose, And, Jesus is like, what is that to you? You follow me, and I think that's where we need to live. And I'm not suggesting that eschatology is something we shouldn't study. My goodness, I've written a book. But I say studied. I plan to keep studying it, and everything. But I want to do it with the instructions that Jesus has given us, namely to be faithful now and don't be obsessed with the future, that I need to be faithful now. And I think that's our calling. He had, the thing that he's given us to look forward to is his return, and to keep our eyes on the fact that he could return any moment. And I should say this too, the reason I wrote the book is because I grew very weary of sensationalism and people picking up on things and then pairing it with an eschatological verse and running with it. And I felt like that sensationalism does damage. My book on eschatology wasn't to figure out the future. Far from it. I mean, I say in the book, there's a lot we cannot know. My goal with the book was to remind us that we are only human, and the present that we've been given, that's the true gift. And we need to be responsible with Scripture and be humble, and to think clearly about very fascinating texts. And then if we don't understand them completely, that's okay. And we can pray that the Lord gives us insight, and I think he will. But ultimate insight won't come until he comes again.
I want to thank Lexham Press for sending me a copy of the book to read and for helping me to set up this interview with Dr. Halsted. Now, Dr. Halsted briefly discussed Matthew chapter 24. That chapter and its parallels is very important. Many skeptics think that it shows that Jesus is actually a failed apocalyptic prophet because he made a false prophecy. They think that he was wrong about the timing of his return. He said that it would happen within his generation, but it didn't. So was Jesus wrong? I don't think so, and to see why, check out this video right here.